Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. You guys have sent over some fascinating stuff this time around.
Yeah, it's like a lot to unpack.
It really does. We're diving into the new presidential administration, kind of those first steps they're taking.
Fresh start.
Exactly. And to help us break it all down, we've got these excerpts from a news segment with Larry Kudlow.
Oh, right. The economic advisor.
That's him. I think a lot of folks might remember him from his time on TV, too.
Definitely a familiar face.
For sure. So Kudlow is basically breaking down what looks like just a whirlwind of activity, right?
From what you've shared, yeah, it sounds like a lot's happening.
Executive orders, potential new tariffs, a lot of opinions flying around, but the big focus seems to be the economy.
Well, that's usually a top priority for any new administration, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And Kudlow even listed out some of these areas the administration's targeting right out of the gate.
Like what?
We're talking environmental regulations, immigration, even policies around woke DEI.
Woke DEI. That's a term we might need to do a whole separate deep dive on someday.
Totally agree. It's definitely loaded.
It is.
But yeah, based on this news segment, it really seems like the administration is going for big changes, and they're not wasting any time, especially when it comes to the economy.
Well, that rapid-fire approach is definitely interesting. I mean, what does it tell us? It suggests a focus on immediate action,
Yeah.
right? Maybe even prioritizing speed over, say, consensus building.
That's a really good point, because historically, that kind of approach has had, well, mixed results, hasn't it?
It has. It can definitely show decisiveness and make it clear what their vision is.
Right.
But
But at the same time, it can also lead to some pushback, even legal challenges down the road if things aren't, carefully thought through.
exactly.
So it makes you wonder about the long-term strategy here, right?
Yeah, are these quick wins just to kind of set the tone, build some momentum? Or is this a sign of how they plan to govern the whole time? Like, do they prefer swift action over taking more time to really deliberate?
Really interesting questions. It'll definitely be interesting to watch how it all plays out.
It will. And speaking of things that could have a big impact down the line, we have to talk about that mention of a potential tariff on goods from China.
Oh, yeah, the 10% tariff.
Yeah. Now, tariffs are essentially taxes on imported goods.
Right. So, like, if that 10% tariff happens, it means things from China could get more expensive here in the U.S.
Exactly. And they're often used as like a bargaining tool in trade negotiations.
Right. Trying to make things more even for businesses here or protecting certain industries.
Exactly. Now, Kudlow mentioned that the president believes foreign governments shouldn't be allowed to tax American businesses.
Which seems to be the thinking behind this whole tariff idea.
It does.
Yeah.
But it's a complicated thing, lots of moving pieces. Because if those prices go up, it can hit your wallet directly. Everyday things could just cost more.
Yeah. Definitely something to keep in mind. And then there's the question of how China might react.
Right. Will they just take it? Or will they retaliate with tariffs of their own? And that could lead to a trade war, which could have global consequences, really impact the economy on a big scale.
It's a lot to think about. And actually, it's not just China either. Kudlow also brought up some tension around that USMCA trade agreement.
The one with Mexico and Canada?
That's the one. And it sounds like things are getting pretty urgent.
Urgent how?
Well, he mentioned there were only 8 days left to finalize negotiations.
Wow, that's a tight deadline.
It is. Seems like the administration is really putting a lot of weight on these trade deals.
Yeah, and they might be ready to, play hardball to get what they want.
Like that comment from Kudlow about Mexico and Canada needing to play ball when it comes to border security.
That definitely sounds like a pretty firm stance. Makes you wonder what the U.S. might be willing to give up, what compromises they might make to get those wins on border security.
Yeah, and what those compromises could mean for businesses and people on both sides of the border. But shifting back to the U.S. for a second, Kudlow also said CEOs are giddy about this new administration.
Giddy. That's an interesting choice of words. I wonder what he's basing that on.
Me too. Because the business world is so diverse, right? What makes one CEO excited might totally freak another one out.
Exactly. Some might love the idea of less regulation and maybe some tax cuts.
Right. While others might be worried about trade wars or just all this rapid change.
It's like some see this as a chance to jump on some brand new opportunities, while others are battening down the hatches, just waiting to see what happens.
And it makes you think about the people who might not benefit from this boom Kudlow keeps talking about.
That's a really important point. Economic growth doesn't always mean everyone wins, right?
Definitely not. We need to be asking who's actually benefiting from these policies and who might get left behind in all the shuffle.
Couldn't agree more. There are always winners and losers, and we need to see the whole picture.
Well said. It really does make you think, like, who benefits the most from all of this?
Absolutely. And I think it's interesting how Kudlow frames this whole thing.
What do you mean?
Well, he keeps using this phrase, reinvention of government.
Yeah. What's that all about? Is it just like a bunch of fancy words?
It seems to cover a few different things. But one big idea is shrinking the size of government.
Oh, okay. So less government involvement, kind of a hands-off approach.
Exactly. Lots of talk about deregulation and cutting back on all that bureaucracy.
So the idea is to let businesses do their thing without so much government interference.
Yeah, that's the basic philosophy. Let the private sector drive economic growth, not the government.
Interesting. Has that kind of approach worked before?
Well, it's been tried in different ways throughout history, with mixed results.
Makes sense. It's never simple, is it?
Never. And Kudlow actually brought up a point about executive orders.
Those were definitely a hot topic with the previous president, too, right?
Exactly. But Kudlow's saying those were on the wrong side of things.
So basically, it all depends on whose side you're on.
It does seem that way sometimes, doesn't it? What one administration sees as totally necessary, another one might call government overreach.
It's all about perspective, I guess.
It really is. And that's why it's so important to look past the talking points and really think about what these policy changes could mean down the road, no matter who's in charge.
I totally agree. We have to think for ourselves.
Absolutely. And one area where this reinvention could have a big impact is climate change.
Oh, yeah. Kudlow had some strong words about that. Something about the climate war being over.
He did. Basically declared the previous administration's push for renewable energy and all those regulations on fossil fuels to be done.
Wow, that's a big shift. So what happens now? What does it mean for the environment and for, all the companies that produce energy?
Well, if the focus shifts back to things like oil and gas, it could have big consequences, both good and bad.
Like what?
Well, on one hand, we might see lower energy prices, which could help businesses and consumers.
That sounds good.
It could.
Yeah.
But it could also mean more air pollution and slow down the progress we've made on fighting climate change.
Right, that's the trade-off.
Exactly. And it could even cause some tension with other countries who are really pushing for cleaner energy.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like a global issue now.
It is. What the U.S. does affects everyone.
And speaking of global issues, let's go back to those USMCA trade negotiations for a minute.
Sure.
Kudlow seemed pretty confident that Mexico and Canada would just play ball on border security, but I'm not so sure.
Why not?
Well, that whole play ball thing just sounds kind of forceful, like a threat almost.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Like they have no choice but to do what the U.S. wants.
It definitely reflects a more assertive approach.
But those negotiations are complicated, right? Each country has its own goals.
Exactly. And while border security is definitely important for the U.S., Mexico and Canada have their own concerns too.
Of course. It's not a one-way street.
Right. They'll be looking for things in return, like lower tariffs or better access to U.S. markets.
So it's all about finding a compromise that works for everyone.
Pretty much. And the stakes are high.
Mm.
These trade deals affect businesses, workers, consumers on both sides of the border.
It's all connected.
It is. Now, Kudlow also mentioned the issue of fentanyl trafficking, which is a huge problem, obviously.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking how many lives it's destroying.
Absolutely. And he even talked about potentially using military force to combat it.
Whoa, seriously, isn't that a bit extreme?
It's definitely a controversial idea, and it raises a lot of questions about whether it would actually work and if it could even make things worse.
Yeah, like what if it just creates more tension with Mexico?
Exactly. It could make it harder to cooperate on other issues like trade or immigration.
It's a risky move for sure.
It is. And it feels like we're entering this new era where the lines between domestic and foreign policy are getting really blurry.
I know what you mean. It's also interconnected now.
It is. What happens in one area has ripple effects everywhere else.
And speaking of blurred lines, Kudlow also talked about using artificial intelligence for border security.
Oh yeah, that's a whole other can of worms.
Right. It sounds futuristic and kind of scary at the same time.
I know. Like something out of a movie.
Exactly. But it's really happening. We're talking about algorithms making decisions about who gets into the country.
It's mind-blowing. And it raises some serious questions about privacy and fairness.
Yeah.
Like, are these systems biased? Do they treat everyone equally?
It's a lot of power to give to a machine.
It is.
Yeah.
And we need to be having those tough conversations about the ethics of all this, making sure people's rights are protected.
Absolutely. Technology is a powerful tool, but we have to use it responsibly.
I couldn't agree more.
Well, this deep dive has been quite a ride so far. We've gone from business booms to trade deals to AI and border security. It seems like this new administration is shaking things up on every front.
It's definitely a dynamic time full of both challenges and opportunities.
And it's up to us to stay informed and engaged so we can make sense of it all.
Couldn't have said it better myself. This is just a snapshot, a starting point for all of us to continue exploring these issues.
Absolutely. And as always, we encourage everyone to keep those sources coming, keep learning, and keep thinking critically about the world around us. You know, it's easy to get lost in all the big global stuff, right?
For sure.
Trade wars, AI, government overhauls, but I keep coming back to the people.
The human element.
Yeah, like Kudlow keeps painting this rosy picture of a booming economy.
Yeah, lots of optimism.
But what about the people who might not benefit from all that, you know?
Yeah, what about the families struggling to put food on the table if those tariffs make everything more expensive?
Exactly. Or the communities that might be hurt if environmental regulations get rolled back.
It's really important to look beyond the positive spin
Yeah.
and consider the potential downsides too.
Because economic growth doesn't always mean everyone wins.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We have to ask, like, who's actually benefiting and who might end up worse off?
It feels like we need to have a whole other conversation about what kind of society we want to build.
I think that's crucial. It's about values,
Yeah.
right? What do we prioritize?
And that's why staying informed and engaged is so important. We can't just passively accept what we hear.
Right. We need to dig deeper, understand the nuances, and ask ourselves if these changes are taking us in the direction we want to go.
Which is what these deep dives are all about, right? Helping people connect the dots and see the bigger picture.
Exactly. It's about empowering people to be critical thinkers, not just, absorbing information without questioning it.
And holding our leaders accountable for the decisions they make.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because those decisions have real consequences for people's lives.
Speaking of which, Kudlow also brought up immigration, which is always a hot-button issue.
Yeah, seems like you can't have a political conversation these days without it coming up.
And he used some pretty loaded language, too, talking about open borders and remain in Mexico.
Right. Framing it as a threat to national security.
But we have to be careful with that kind of rhetoric.
Absolutely. It's easy to get swept up in fear-mongering and lose sight of the facts.
And the human stories behind those headlines.
Exactly. Because we're not talking about abstract concepts here. We're talking about real people.
Families seeking asylum, workers looking for a better life, communities built by generations of immigrants.
It's about recognizing their humanity, understanding their struggles, and challenging those narratives that try to paint them as the enemy.
It's about empathy, compassion, and remembering that we're all in this together.
I couldn't have said it better myself. At the end of the day, it's about people, not just politics or policies.
Well said. Well, I think that about wraps it up for this deep dive.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have. From the nitty-gritty of economic policy to these big questions about ethics, values, and what it all means for everyday people.
It's been a fascinating conversation, and I hope it's given everyone some food for thought.
Me too. And remember, this is just the beginning of the conversation.
Right. It's up to all of us to keep learning, keep thinking critically, and keep talking about these important issues.
Because they affect all of us.
They do. So stay informed, stay engaged, and keep those sources coming.
That's right. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time.